This is Swakhammer's Welding from Fine Scale Minatures. It was released in 1990. This is one of 650 that was produced, and the original price was $195. This typically sells on eBay in the $400 to $500 range. I paid in the high $400 for this. I'm not entirely sure that it's worth it. I think there's other kits that are just as interesting that sell for less, but this one's a little hard to find. So if you want to build this specific kit, you're going to have to pay for it. Fine Scale Miniatures is, of course, the company created by George Sellios, the famous modeler. They stopped making kits in 2016. Some of their kits are pretty realistic, others are a little more wacky. This is one of the wackier ones. It includes an insane amount of roof details. I didn't even put them all on, and I still think it looks a little bit crazy, but that's part of the fun of this kit. The kit includes a truck model from Highway Miniatures, but I did not build that as part of this video. Fine Scale Miniatures kits typically include a lot of really good quality metal castings. This kit is no exception. There are basically two buildings to this kit. There's the stone building, which is all metal casting walls, and there is the wood building, and then there's a lot of accessories such as the loading crane, loading dock, and a little shed. This is a fairly difficult build. It's not that any one area is particularly difficult. There's just a lot to this kit and a lot of detail work that goes into it. One of the things I really like about FSM kits is they typically include plenty of scale lumber, at least to build the kit as is described in the instructions. For the most part, everything fit together except for putting the two buildings together, and you'll see more about that later in the video. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you should know that I've changed up some of my paint techniques for this video, and I've added a few new things that I haven't done in the past. If you're actually going to build this kit, I suggest you check out my G. Willikers video if you haven't seen it already. The two kits were released only 2 years apart, and they're actually pretty similar, even if the buildings don't really look all that similar. There are a lot of techniques that I covered in the G. Willikers video that I skipped over in this one just to avoid the repetition. In spite of the difficulties, I was really happy with how this kit turned out. I didn't make any major mistakes, although there are a few flaws. The instructions assume that you're going to build this as a diorama. I did not do that, and about the only thing I had to give up was a small crane off the stone building. Construction starts with the stone building. The walls for the stone building are cast metal. I glued them together with 5-minute epoxy. Then I sprayed them with Tamiya primer. So over the last several videos, I've developed a painting technique that I like to use for stone and for concrete. And I'll put that on the screen. At this point, I've painted the base coat and I'm giving it a wash of Vallejo dark brown. My original plan for this building was to build a realistic building that could be in use, but as I went along, it began to look more and more abandoned, so I really went with the abandoned theme. It still could be in use, though. Next, I apply Folk Art iced coffee and I use a sponge. Okay, so I did actually screw this up. The iced coffee is supposed to go on before the wash, but you wouldn't know that if I didn't tell you. So moving right along with the stone building, I've attached the doors and windows and I'm ready to install the roof. So I'm doing that with 5-minute epoxy. When you glue down the roof cardboard, you want to try and be sure that the roof is actually flat and doesn't have curves because that makes it difficult to attach the rafters later. It looks like I got some curvature in at the front of this building, and so I'm kind of cutting it apart and trying to flatten it out so that the roof is flat for when I attach the rafters. In the end, I had to break the rafter in two to make it kind of follow up around the curve of the roof. The kit includes sheets of corrugated metal for the roof of the stone building. In the past, I've done a lot of corrugated metal roofing, and I typically give it a pretty vibrant, rusted looking appearance, but it's not entirely realistic. So for this build, I wanted to do a really more realistic corrugated roof building. Where I live, there are a lot of barns that have flat sheet metal roofing, but not a lot with corrugated metal roofing. But this example is one that I found. And one of the common things that I see is that most of the roofing panels look like solid rust. They're not really all that many vibrant colors. It's kind of a solid color of rust. But you often see replacement panels that are still the original color and only have a little bit of rust. And so I wanted to try and mimic that on my stone part of the building. The first thing I did was cut the panels to the correct size and tape them to a piece of cardboard with the sticky side of the tape facing up. Then I sprayed the panels with either a rust color or a gray color using enamel from a rattle can. Most of the panels got sprayed with the rust color, but some of the panels were just sprayed with gray. Now I am coming back and I am dry brushing some gray over all of the panels. Now I have a couple different rust colors from Americana. This is just craft store paint, and I'm applying it very lightly with a sponge. I don't want to get a lot of these colors on the pieces. See, I'm just kind of going over a few pieces and not really making it very widespread. Now I'm switching to a fairly heavy dry brush of the same colors. But again, I want to keep it subtle. I still want to have the base color be dominant on the panels. This is the hoist house for the roof of the stone building. You cut it out from a cardboard template provided. It gets covered in tar paper strips, so here I am cutting the tar paper strips from the sheet they provide. For some reason, this hoist house was a lot more difficult to assemble than you would think it would be. I think it's because it's an awkwardly cut piece of cardboard. Now I apply trim pieces around the door opening of the hoist house. I've already stained most of the wood with a gray household stain. I find this easier than trying to paint the individual pieces. I also painted most of the doors and windows before beginning the assembly of the building. Cardboard structures like this are pretty common in FSM kits, so you wouldn't think this would be that complicated, but for some reason this one was giving me fits. Once you get the basic assembly done, glue some paper strips to the corners to cover up the seams. I painted the hoist house with Tamiya NATO black, then I gave it a dry brush of dark gray and a slightly lighter dry brush of a lighter gray. I really didn't have much of an idea of what color scheme to use. For the doors and windows, I painted them with Vallejo Field Drab, just kind of leaving them a brown color. Then they got a wash of Vallejo Dark Brown Wash or Vallejo Dark Gray, which is basically black. And then they were dry brushed with some lighter shades of brown. Here I'm assembling the cupolas that go on top of the stone building. These are cast metal parts. Now it's time to start applying the corrugated metal roofing panels. So I carefully pull them off the sheet of cardboard where they're still taped on with the masking tape, and I glue them on using super glue gel. You have to be careful not to bend the sheets excessively as you pull them off the tape. I really recommend that you cut the pieces before you paint them. That way when you spray paint them, you'll paint the edges and you won't have shiny edges. If you paint them first and then cut the sheets, you'll have shiny edges where you made the cuts. This is still a problem later on when you trim the sheets, but it's much more manageable. Now I'm applying the corrugated metal roofing to the main building. Some of the pieces have to be cut to fit, and the easiest way to cut these corrugated metal pieces is with a chopper. Expect to have to replace the blade a couple of times. These are two pieces of brass that are supposed to be stovepipes or some kind of stacks to come up out of the roof. and I kind of remembered that they were there. And since it's pretty difficult to cut these at an angle, I'm glad I remembered, because I'm going to have to cut holes in the roof, or certainly easier to cut holes in the roof and put them in, and then put the corrugated roofing around that. So I'm going to try and do that. It looks like they placed one about here, like right behind there, and another one right over here. It's very difficult to install a piece of tubing like this and have it be perfectly vertical. So what I did was I glued sticks of wood into the tubes and made it so that the tube was about the correct height when the wood hit the bottom of the building or hit the desk. And that way, when I stuck the tube into the roof, the wood sticks would hit the desk, and the desk would kind of hold them in place in their vertical position, so they didn't have a tendency to shift off one way or the other. Well, I cut kind of odd-shaped, almost square holes in a roof to fit round pipes, and so there's gaps around the pipes and between the pipe and the roof. And I'm trying to fill that with epoxy putty because I kind of figured it was the best thing to kind of cram in there. So that's what I'm doing. You can see the wooden sticks sticking down from the bottom of each of the pipe that I used to hold the pipe in a vertical position. Now I'm using AK Interactive Asphalt to represent tar packed in to seal the gap between the pipe and the roof. So roofing this building was kind of complicated, cutting all the pieces to the right size to fit around the cupolas and to fit around the pipes. But I think it turned out pretty good. But by this time, I was pretty sick of the stone building. It's time to take it over to the wood building. Well, I don't know how many videos I've done of these wood buildings, and yet I've never bought one of these. So this is a Pounce wheel, and I got it off eBay for about $12 to $14. And I think that this is the 1/4-inch size. You want the smallest size you can get. And the purpose of this is to put nail holes in your clapboard building. So here I have kind of a test piece, and I'm just going to run it through. This is really the first time I have ever used this thing on a kit. So I line everything up with a steel ruler, and really you want to use a pretty thin steel ruler. This one was a little too fat and it kind of rubbed against the edge wrong. It was a little bit hard to keep a straight line. In the diagrams in the kit, he actually tells you where to put the nail holes in the wood walls. So here I am, just that much practice, and I'm already starting in on the actual walls in the kit. I would say this was really worthwhile. I think it really enhanced the appearance of the building, and it was a pretty easy thing to do. I can't believe it took me so long to get started on this. After the nail holes, the next step in construction of the wood building is bracing and trim. There's really 3 sections to the wood building. There's the main building, a side warehouse, and then there is the row of windows on top of the roof of the main building. The main building has a concrete base that is represented by these wood pieces. You have to cut out sections of the wood pieces so that it fits around the loading dock doors. It's easy enough to do that with a sharp knife. This is one of the areas where I've deviated from the previous builds. I didn't want to use the sponge technique to give a chipped paint look. Normally what I would do is paint some kind of a gray color and then apply the base building color using a sponge. In this case, what I did was spray all of the wood pieces with a primer, and then I sprayed Vallejo Desert Yellow from a spray can. This is about the same color that George Celios used in his sample build of the kit. He doesn't include any color pictures of this kit with the kit. I found a picture of it online. With the base color on the walls, it's time to apply the sign. So one trick to apply a paper sign like this is to sand away some of the paper from the back side of the sign. I'm using a really fine grit sanding sponge to do this. This makes the paper thinner, and it's less obvious that it's a piece of paper glued to the wall. It looks more like it's just painted on. I attached the sign to the wall using white glue. When you do this, you want to be pretty careful not to get any glue on the front of the sign. Now I burnished the sign into the clapboard boards using a round wooden toothpick. I found that this works pretty well and doesn't tear the paper. Once this glue dries, it's pretty important to spray the sign with an acrylic sealer or something like Tester's Dull Coat so that subsequent weathering, like with washes or paints, does not damage the paper. Now it's time to begin assembly of the wood building. I've already attached the main loading dock doors. I paint the inside of the building black so you can't see anything when you look in the windows. It's common on a lot of abandoned or dilapidated buildings that the clapboard has fallen away or been torn away, and you can see the studs and the insides of the walls. I decided to replicate that on my building. First, I need to remove some of the bracing. One of the things I love about wood kits is how easy it is to cut them apart when you want to make changes. Now I cut away a section of the wall. This is adjacent to one of the large doors that has trim. So first I removed the piece of trim that I had added. Once I've cut away the wall, I'll add the piece of trim back. Now I add back in the studs using scale 2x4s. If you're going to get into building these kits, it's nice to have a good supply of scale lumber of different sizes lying around. Now I add the inner wall using scale lumber. I ended up doing this in about 4 different areas of this building. This is the concrete base for the main building. I gouged out some areas of the wood, and I'm filling those areas in with Vallejo sand texture to represent where the aggregate for the concrete has become visible. I also used the sand texture to fill in the cracks around the corners. This is mostly hidden in the final build anyway. Now that I've realized I'm going to build an abandoned and dilapidated building, I wanted to do a little more weathering on the paint. So here I'm applying folk art barn wood with a sponge. I'm trying to avoid hitting the doors and windows that I already painted, but I am applying it over the sign. It's important to angle the bottom of the walls of this section so there's a tight fit on the roof. I'm doing that with a razor blade and with an emery board. The roof of the wood building is covered with paper shingles. They come on a roll that has a sticky backing. You get the backing wet and then you stick on the shingles. I saved you having to watch this. I'm not showing it in videos anymore. It's just not that interesting. However, one of the disadvantages is because the shingles are wet, they cause the cardboard to curl. So I frequently have to glue wood braces down on the cardboard to keep it flat. In this particular case, the braces were too long and the roof didn't fit onto the building. That's not a big deal. You just carve away the wood braces where they're too long. It's also important to angle the top of the walls so that you get a tight fit with the roof. It's easy enough to do this with a razor blade. Now I'm attaching the roof to the side building. I have not yet attached the side building to the main building. I'm just putting the roof on. I have them in place so I know how it's going to fit. For a little more weathering on the walls, I'm using a Vallejo brown wash. This is not the dark brown wash that I use so often. It's just regular brown. I later add some other shades of browns and blacks, trying to achieve the correct weathered look that I'm going for. Painting the roof starts with a gray primer and then, to me, a dark sea gray as a base color. Now it's time to glue the two building sections together. I cover the gap in the roof of the two building sections with strips of paper. This is the large loading dock. You build it using a template they provide. I attach the main support strips to the template using blue tack. The joists are pre-cut. Fine Scale Miniatures seems to use the same loading dock design for most of their kits, so once you've built one, you kind of see how to build the rest of them. Now we get to the crane, which is one of the cool features of this build. It's a little bit tricky to build. Most of the strips are pre-cut, and that helps, but you still have to figure out which strip goes where. You use the template to build the crane, but it's always a little bit tricky trying to build a three-dimensional object off a two-dimensional template. Now back to the roof. The next step in painting is a wash of Vallejo dark brown. This building has 5 different canopies that you're supposed to cut out of the cardboard template. You then apply rafter tails to the cardboard canopies. I decided to do something different for this build since I'm building a dilapidated building. The original idea for the kit is that the cardboard canopies are covered with tar paper strips. I start by scalloping out some strips of scale lumber so they look like they've rotted away. I think these are scale 2x8s. And then I glue them together adjacent like this using strips. I want to make sure that I have enough strips to be as wide as my largest canopy. Then I'm going to take the rafters, and I'm going to use the size of the end rafters that they give you, and I'm going to apply those across the strips. And I'm going to use rafters all the way down full length for the width of the canopy. So effectively, I'm rebuilding the entire canopy out of scale lumber. I'm not going to use the cardboard at all except as a size template. This technique is a lot of work and you'll need some extra scale lumber, but it gives you a very realistic looking canopy, particularly for a dilapidated building. You can choose to cover with tar paper or not, or even corrugated metal. In the end, I decided to just leave it as exposed wood. From this section, I'm going to be able to get 5 canopies for the smaller doors. Once again, we are back to painting the roof, and we're using Vallejo IJN Ash Gray, sprayed on very lightly through an airbrush. I'm using a number 2 nozzle and needle. This will be followed by a very light spray of Vallejo Dirt, which is kind of a golden brown color. I think these airbrush oversprays on the roof really help the appearance, so if you have an airbrush, I recommend this technique. If you don't have an airbrush, I recommend that you get one because even a really good airbrush is inexpensive compared to the cost of this kit. And after the airbrushing, it's time for the weathering powders. I really recommend weathering powders. I think they really enhance the look of the building, especially if you're trying to make an old building. They kind of mute all of the colors and kind of bring everything together and just give it a generally dusty appearance. After the weathering powders, you have to spray with some kind of a sealer to hold the weathering powders in place, such as Tester's Dull Coat, Tamiya Flat Clear, or some kind of a flat acrylic sealer. Keep in mind that weathering powders are different than pigments. Pigments are kind of clumpy, and I think they're supposed to be mixed with a liquid. Weathering powders are much finer and they go on dry. I like to apply them with makeup brushes. It's common in this part of the country to see large amounts of foliage like vines growing on the sides of old buildings, so I wanted to recreate that on this kit. I'm going to do that using this foliage from Woodland Scenics. It comes in sheets in various different colors. I got two colors, a medium green and a light green. The sheets look like you could tear them, but you really have to cut them with scissors. I start by cutting them to approximately the correct size. To attach them, I start with full strength white glue, and I spread that on the wall. Then some final trimming on the vegetation, and I just attach it to the wall. Then I cover the vegetation with diluted white glue, or you could use scenic cement for this. I really want to get all of the vegetation soaked with the diluted white glue. Eventually, when the glue dries, the vegetation should be pretty hard. This is a pretty messy process. The foliage leaves little particles all over the place. I did the same thing on the stone building, and somewhat surprisingly, the white glue was pretty effective at holding the foliage to the metal castings. I generally use the medium green first and then cover little sections with the lighter green. Once you have soaked the vegetation with the diluted white glue, it's best to let the building dry on some parchment paper so that you don't glue it to your table. For the various loading docks and the canopies and the crane, my painting technique was my usual method of light gray followed by Vallejo dark gray wash and then dry brushing Vallejo silver gray. The crane has a traveling rig that travels on rails, so the rails are not included with the kit. You have to add your own. I have some N-scale flex track and I'm cutting that to length, and I'm going to take the rails from that and put it on the crane. I painted the rails with the camouflage red-brown, which is a color I really like using for painting track. I'm finally at the point of trying to fit the two buildings together, and there's a problem in that this roof is just too high to clear under this roof. And so I looked at the instructions and they acknowledged that, and they said what you had to do is cut a little V-shaped in here. And I'm just kind of thinking that when George realized this, he was probably pretty upset with himself for allowing such a kind of a simple mistake to be put in one of his kits. So I guess that's what I'm going to have to do. So it's not really a big deal. I use a razor blade to cut the notch out of the roof so the buildings fit together. One of the last details is to paint the tar sealer around the roof elements. I like to do this using thick black acrylic paint from a tube. It kind of fills in some of the gaps. The very last thing that I did was spray the entire wood building with a very light overspray of Vallejo Light Olive. This kind of mutes the colors, it kind of reduces the contrast, it kind of brings everything together, and the olive color gives it kind of a mossy look. It's pretty subtle, but I think it's a nice effect.